Was the Apollo mission a hoax? If the question is, how do you hide a lie? The answer is, with another lie. The Plagiaran extraterrestrials who have been in contact with Billy Meier for several decades, give us details about the Apollo program. Contrary to many conspiracy theories, they tell us NASA in fact did make several successful moon landings during the Apollo mission program. However, they also confirmed that the Apollo 11 moon landing never actually happened. It was the first NASA hoax. They then tell us about how the Apollo 13 did not in fact have a failure as NASA presented to the world. It was the second NASA hoax. How was it possible to perpetrate a lie to billions of people by performing these two hoaxes? In this video, we set out to analyze a sequential timeline of events that outline all what Billy Meier and the Plagiaran have told us over the years, as well as our own observations and questions about how it all could have happened. All this put together encapsulates and shapes the information you are about to receive. Our aim is to expose some facts along with some evidential factors for consideration. It is, however, very important that each and every one viewing this video think for themselves, so as to conclude if all this is possible or even probable. Maybe even true. Here is a highlight of key events in the timeline. 1. Kennedy's speech. On September 12, 1962, President Kennedy declares that the USA will reach the moon in the 1960s. 2. JFK is dead. November 22, 1963. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. 3. Apollo reached the moon. On December 21, 1968, Apollo 8 is the first of the Apollo missions to reach the moon, and it did it in a record time of 2 days and 20 hours. This fact will be important later. 4. A new president. January 20, 1969. Richard Nixon became President of the United States. 5. Apollo very close to land on the moon. On May 18, 1969, Apollo 10 flew to the moon. It went very close to its surface with its lunar modules, but did not land there. The mission was successful. These 5 events created the preconditions for the Apollo 11 hoax to happen. Billy Meier, in an interview done some years ago, told us that Apollo 11 did not land on the moon. This is based on conversations he had with his extraterrestrial friends, the Plagiaran.
Wegen Apollo 11, da habe ich dann sowieso etwas ganz Besonderes. Die Apollo 11 Mission, das war ein Schwindel von A bis Z. Ist überhaupt nicht passiert. Die Mondlandung, der Mondflug ist nicht passiert. Das ist alles schaustellermäßig, filmmäßig ist das aufbereitet worden und nachher überspielt worden ins in Houston Zentrum, wie heißt das? Airspace Center, oder wie das heißt. Dann ist alles da überspielt worden und alle, die mitgemacht haben, sind durch diese Filme betrogen worden. Haben auch nichts davon gewusst. So ist auch die ganze Welt übers Ohr gehauen worden.
The Billy Meier interview clip you just saw, plus the information contained in the contact reports and publicly available information, informs the understanding about how we think the NASA hoax of the Apollo 11 was executed. 6. Before the liftoff of Apollo 11. It is said NASA had created a lunar simulated training site for astronauts, a replica of the lunar surface, where Apollo 11 was supposed to land. The astronauts trained in this facility whilst wearing their spacesuits and performing practice activities. In this facility, they managed to simulate the moon's low gravity by using a kind of cable that would be fastened to spacesuits, so as to create a counterweight that pulled the astronauts upwards, thus reducing their net weight sufficiently to simulate the effects of low gravity. Someone weighing 70 kilograms would be lifted by the cables with a force of 58 kilograms, which in turn would simulate a weight of only 11.6 kilograms. This is equal to the weight under the moon's gravity. With this system, they could simulate walking by performing small jumps, as they practiced in this training site. The original intention of using this training facility could have been to discover possible problems or challenges that might arise when the real walk on the moon would take place. We think that President Nixon, nervous about the possibility of America failing its first lunar landing attempt, decided to create or merely participated in a deception that would be made to appear that NASA had succeeded in landing on the moon, but without actually doing so. But what could be wrong that made the perpetrators of the first hoax so nervous? It was already tested that a lunar module could be in Moon's orbit and even get close to the Moon's surface. But there was something that was not already tested: landing. That phase of slowing down the lunar module, and then landing on the moon could end up in a catastrophic failure, a crash, or maybe even the module could have tipped over. Either one would have been catastrophic landing failures, preventing the astronauts from returning to the space module and safe back to Earth. The Pleiaren tell us that the group creating this fabrication was constituted by Wernher von Braun, Wernher's assistant, Ernst Stullinger, and a small group, in all totaling 37 people. We think Nixon was not only involved, but promoting the fraud. It is this small group of 37 people that made all the secret preparations to carry out the fraud. The Pleiaren do not give us details on how the hoax operation was done. They just tell us the Apollo 11 never landed on the moon, as we heard from Billy Meier in the video clip. But it is our conclusion that the Apollo 11 astronauts must have boarded the Saturn V, actually traveled to the moon, performed several orbits around it, without landing, and then they came back. The operating words here being, without landing. You see, NASA wanted certainty, a guaranteed moon landing, but they had never done it before, and there were two major risks that could deliver an unacceptable failure. So, it is likely they thought it would be easier to simply repeat what the Apollo 10 mission had already accomplished before. Apollo 11 would set out to secretly repeat the Apollo 10 mission, without actually landing, and without anyone in the world knowing, except the group of 37. In all, the mission control staff and the world at large were unaware of the hoax, nor did any of them ever realize the Apollo 11 never actually landed. Everyone in the world witnessed the three astronauts boarding the Saturn V rocket, lifting off as they flew into space, and then sending transmissions from the moon, and then coming back in the capsule, by splash landing into the ocean. This was a global event. It is our conclusion that the Apollo 11 astronauts most likely transmitted all the audio signals from the spacecraft when it was close to the moon. They needed to make the transmission from the moon. It would have never been possible to execute the hoax without a successful flight, or by staying on Earth's surface and transmitting the signals from Earth. You see, the space module's signal was not only picked up by Houston. Due to Earth's rotation, it was necessary for NASA to collaborate with other communication stations around the Earth, so round-the-clock transmissions could be received. So, sending the transmission from Earth, through signals to Houston was not possible. Therefore, the conclusion is that Apollo 11 did in fact fly and transmit from the moon. But how did they simulate the landing? The only conclusion we can present considers a premeditated plan, where the group of 37 prepared several film recordings of the astronauts practicing during their simulated moon walks. This they could do during any of the routine exercises inside the practice facility, which had a perfect moon surface replica and a lunar module for the astronauts to execute their practice exit and entry into the lunar module and the actual lunar walks. As Billy Meier said, this group of 37 managed to record several video shots at the simulated training site, and in turn created a final video version that the Apollo 11 astronauts took with them into Saturn V. We conclude it was this fake version that simulated the last moments, when the spacecraft touched lunar soil, and other scenes in which Armstrong and Aldrin appeared descending from the lunar module to walk on the surface soil for the first time, were in fact only simulated practice runs performed in this training facility. These short scenes were not difficult to record, given the training center was a replica of the moon's surface. 7. Apollo 11 lifts off. So what and how did it happen, when on July 16, 1969, the Saturn V lifted off into space, whilst the entire world held their breath for the Apollo 11 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins? Yes, Apollo 11 is headed toward the moon, and according to our conclusions, they have with them the pre-recorded video the world heard and saw. 8. Apollo 11 landing. On July 20, 1969, the astronauts were in orbit around the moon. NASA tells us that they used the same path that Apollo 10 followed on the previous mission. The astronauts transmitted images of the moon's surface while getting closer, during the descent to the lunar surface. But at some point, during their real transmission, we conclude they swapped the feed, and we think this is when they began to transmit the pre-recorded fake moon landing and moonwalk video. In this pre-recorded video, the world watched the lunar module touch the ground, followed by the exit from the module and lunar walk, but in reality, they were orbiting the moon. The pre-recorded video was transmitted from this point on, but the audio sound of the conversations was live, since the astronauts interacted with the operators of the Houston Mission Control Center, and even they talked live with the President of the United States. The video of the astronauts going down the steps of the lunar module was transmitted whilst orbiting the moon. We saw Armstrong descending first. However, they were inside the spacecraft orbiting above the moon, not on the moon's surface. The famous phrase, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," was most likely declared by Armstrong from inside the spacecraft in lunar orbit, or maybe this was also pre-recorded. He was not actually standing on the lunar surface as the fake recording showed. On Earth, many people were very excited about this great event, not suspecting that it was not really happening. It was not easy to realize this deception, since the transmission came from the moon. And as we said, it was picked up by many telecom stations around the globe. Other pre-recorded scenes were transmitted during the remaining 21 hours and 36 minutes, supposedly from the lunar surface. Ultimately, the spacecraft Apollo 11, which never landed, and was making orbits around the moon, set out to return to Earth, and the astronauts were greeted as heroes.